Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Morton. My pronouns are she, her. I am the artist and studio manager here at Baltimore Clayworks, and we are thrilled that you all have joined us. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from my office located on Piscataway and Susquehannock land, currently known as Baltimore, Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual artist talk given today by Jim Bowling. Jim Bowling is a sculptor living and working in Columbus, Ohio, focusing on contemporary expressions of the male form. He primarily works in clay, but frequently incorporates found objects into his work. In addition to his studio practice, he is a professor of art at Otterbein University's Department of Art and Art History, teaching in the areas of ceramics, sculpture, and 3D design. Jim received a BS from the Ohio State University, where he also pursued post-baccalaureate studies in ceramics. He received an MFA in ceramics from Kent State University. As a contemporary ceramic sculptor, Jim is rooted in the material and craft traditions of ceramics, using these techniques to explore concepts related to the construction of personal identity from disparate life experiences. He often uses spiritual, sexual, and political themes, peppered with a slightly twisted sense of humor, to explore identity through the male nude. Jim creates unexpected textures and surface patterns in his forms to underscore and express the narratives of each work. He is influenced and inspired by the ceramic artists of the California funk art movement and surrealist ideology. Jim's work has exhibited regionally, nationally, and internationally, with exhibitions including the San Angelo National Ceramics Competition and at Creta Rome, both as an artist in residence and part of Rome Art Week. His work is in several private collections, as well as the Massillon Museum in Massillon, Ohio, and Del Mar College in Corpus Christi, Texas. Jim is a member of the National Council on Education and Ceramic Arts and serves as a board member for Ohio Design Craftsmen. And I will now turn it over to Jim.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Kayla. It's nice to be part of this. I appreciate getting to talk about my work and kind of my process with this. If you have any questions, I guess we're doing those at the end. But what I'd like to do is share with you, I've got a PowerPoint presentation to facilitate the process going through with some images. And I'd like to just kind of talk a bit about where I came from with it and where I am now and kind of how I got there in between. I'm going to share my screen so you don't have to look at my face and instead see some of the images. So as Rebecca was saying, I am working in Columbus, Ohio. I am originally from Columbus, but I have not lived here all my life, and actually I have quite a lot of viewing, or not viewing, but moving experiences as a kid. I mean, literal physical moving to many different places, and that comes out in quite a bit of my work. For me as an artist who works narratively and talks about life experiences in my work, those are very tied to my own personal experiences, obviously. And so those kind of leak out, hopefully with the idea that other people can connect with it as well. What you're looking at right now is an image from from last summer, actually, not the one just passed, but 2023, of a workshop that we've been running at Otterbein for roughly 16 years, called the Summer Ceramic Institute. That came out of a need I felt to connect my students as undergrads with teachers and graduate students, as well as artists in the community, to do a 2-week summer intensive. They get to work with a visiting artist. Kyle and Kelly Phelps did that for us one year, a few years back. And that's been an important component for me to see happen, because I'm a true believer in the community of artists working together. So that kind of flowed out of my own vision of things. A very important part of my life is my husband, my mate for 30 years, over 30 years now. And this is an image from our 30th anniversary just last year. So I share that because again, in my history of working, he's been very supportive and an important part of my story, and that also comes up in the work. So that is me with hair. It's a great explanation of why I don't try it now. I've had many hair tragedies in my life, but I found this image from an old photo and thought I would share it because of where I was at the time. I mentioned that I moved around a lot. I was born in Columbus, and that had many different locations that I've experienced. A huge part of that had to do with my own family history. My family history, to be quite honest, was quite chaotic, and I could go into a number of different things with that, but leave it to say that my parents' experience of life was very challenged. And I think for my father in particular, there was a need to try to figure out who he was about and what he was about. And I don't think really ever did. It was a very, I'll just use the term interesting family, in that my parents came from very disparate families and also disparate experiences. My father was a child laborer, essentially. He, at 9 years old, in Eastern Kentucky, went to work in the coal mines. My mother did make it to high school, but had her own family tragedies, and somehow I think tragedy found tragedy and created some really interesting experiences. So that by the time, personally, by the time I think I was 12, or I take that back, 11 years old, I had already lived in about 12 different places. So lots of moving, lots of and very few opportunities to connect with other individuals. And that had its own challenges, which I addressed later in life. But I find that I've pulled from that experience some really interesting perspectives, for me, interesting in terms of how I look at my work, how I connect, and how I go there. My early years were years that I found kind of solace and connection in school, and became very focused on academics. My parents were pleased with that. They didn't have that as an experience, didn't quite know how to support me in that. But I kind of figured it out as I went along, and then found that I connected. I did not early on start out in the arts. I didn't really even think about it. I think because of my own upbringing, the idea of how to get out of that was, in my mind, through the sciences. And I made a connection there. Eventually, I discovered toward the end of my academic undergraduate career that it was not quite as satisfying, but I tried continuing on. I actually went into a PhD program in agronomy, sitting in soybean fields, picking flowers off so I could study soybean reproductive physiology. About a year into that program, I started realizing that I was unfulfilled and unhappy, started exploring the arts, and experienced clay for the first time, and it hooked me. I just immediately connected with the material. I connected with, excuse me, the expressive quality of it, the sensation of it. It worked for me in terms of visuals, and it was a new challenge that I hadn't had before. So as a graduate student working on a PhD in agronomy, I made the decision that I was stepping out, returned to an undergraduate post-bac field of study in ceramics, and then did what I needed to there to eventually go on to graduate school. So during that time period, I got to experience artists who were significant to me. As Rebecca mentioned, I really taken and continue to be taken with the California funk art movement, and the the narrative quality of that, but also the self-narrative. It's kind of how the storyline came out in some ways chaotic sensibilities that reflected me. Also, the idea of using oneself for narrative purposes, not necessarily because it's about you, but you're telling the story through your eyes. And so I found a real connection in the work of Robert Arneson, talking about his experiences. Also, the opportunity to not only talk about personal voice, but political and critical issues. And one of my favorites is the piece he did, basically talking about the shooting of Harvey Milk and George Moscone in California. And if you all, I don't know if you're familiar with this piece, but if you look above where it's written George Moscone, those tiered areas, you'll see this little yellow blob with Twinkie on it. And that is in reference to the Twinkie defense that the person who shot both of them pretty much just got off on manslaughter on. So interesting story, both for Harvey Milk's life and George Moscone's life. It's really worth looking at. But for me, I found a person that was resonating with me, not only in the work, but also in the themes of the work. Another early introduction for me within the California funk art movement was the work of Patty Warashina. And I've got on here some of the some older work of hers on the left and more recent work on the right. Patty's work really connected with me also in terms of themes and ideas, her addressing of issues for me and working within the LGBTQIA plus community. At the time, I didn't know why it did. I was not addressing that at all. But I found that for some reason there was a connection in those themes for me personally. I also, looking at these body of work across time in the transition from much more representational work to representation that was stylistically expanding, gave voice over time. I don't think I realized it until I reflected on it later, that my own approach to the form, the male form, could take multiple iterations in multiple directions. And I found that really interesting. So my early pieces did start dealing right away. For some reason, though I was introduced through the wheel, I gravitated to hand building and gravitated toward pieces that were hand built. I pretty much am a coil builder and continue to use that process now, although I've expanded it. So these two works were some of those early explorations, and I found early on that I loved playing with texture, loved playing with juxtaposing different texture. So for me, early on, playing with these bricks and brick walls were kind of a way of playing with very, I guess, very constrained lines, very repetitive form, and laying that against the organic. Over time, that's come for me to represent yin and yang of life, essentially, that with order is chaos and one sort of defines the other. For me, my personal take on that. As I continued on, I went more the direction of exploring the very representational form. I think a lot of that was part of me figuring out my own identity in terms of sexual orientation, but I became very focused on body. I had always been in my head, and that to me, was kind of interesting to get out of my head and start looking at the body, the human form, and the male form in specific. Also, part of my history is that I was involved as a kid in a very, to me, I look at it now as almost cult-like sort of church. It was, I don't know if any of you have heard of holiness churches, but they're ultra conservative, ultra hyper-religious sort of churches, and that was my experience early on with my family's involvement and with everything that was going on at home. I didn't have anything to balance out the extremes because there was this extreme of religion, extreme of family situation. So again, school was important for me. But as time went on and in my adulthood, I did an odd sidestep. I actually converted to Catholicism until, for me personally, I hope I don't offend anyone with this, I came to a point in my adult life where I thought, you know, this isn't relevant to me at all, any of it. And so though I'm not a religious person or Christian or whatever you want to call it, that's just not me. I find referencing those images really kind of intriguing. So for me, this image on the right of the Mary dripping from a faucet out of a stigmata was very representational of religion as a self-serving, promoting sort of system. I continued to look at that and deconstructed the body within the figure. I started asking questions about iconography, particularly in the Catholic Church, and removing the body. What does that mean? And this very kind of vaginal, kind of phallic form emerged as I was working with that kind of traditional Blue Mary look. And it really allowed me to start exploring, hey, what's the idea of sexuality and the almost homoerotic, for me, reference in some of the iconography and the icons of the church. As part of that big Blue Mary, that piece is about 6.5 feet tall, and it was part of a larger exhibition called The Twain Meet, in which she was in the middle of a room of my own version of the Stations of the Cross. So I had these stations going throughout the room with kneelers, with very homoerotic imagery. Instead of it being the passion story, it was a story of passion, and kind of meditating on that passionate connection between two individuals. So for me, using that as a means of looking at relationship and just my own sexuality was an interesting sort of reflection and putting together of my past with my present and future. With the work, I eventually kind of wanted to expand beyond that more representational form, and I started looking at the figure in terms of movement, also in terms of coupling, thinking about my own relationship with my husband, thinking about my interpersonal relationship as a gay individual with other people. So I started doing this series where I reduced the body down essentially to movement, and did a series on individual pieces interacting with one another. This was the first that came out of the series. This is called Head to Head, and just continued exploring interconnections. Part of my history on my father's side is Native American, which I never really put together quite as well as the rest of my family did, because I was that blue-eyed kid out of these brown and green-eyed people. So I kept thinking, can you tell me about the mailman? But that wasn't the case. But I started looking at some of the imagery that I connected with. And so I was incorporating purposely some Native iconography essentially on the imagery. This is a reference to the serpent mounds. And if you look on both figures and these circular openings or actual openings, these pieces kind of reflect my interest in what that means and the connection to the form, just a continuation of looking at some of those figures. Toward the end of that series, I started playing with these forms, trying to figure out how to get them to stand up, and trying to be very confrontational about the idea of the phallus essentially in the forms, simply because I was getting tired actually of work that was being scrutinized because it had a penis essentially in it. I just thought, the heck with this, I'm gonna just put it out there and you guys deal with it. And so in this form, I start engaging with the figures using the phallus as kind of a tripod, essentially, just to help stand the pieces up. I also started generalizing the form and embedding the face into the body. And to be quite honest, I don't know why that started happening, but it was something that just was kind of happenstance, and I started exploring that. I later found out from a colleague of mine teaching in our English department that there are these old Norse, I believe it's Norse, Scandinavian, Norwegian region, I'm not quite sure on that one, but some old sort of fairy tales about these monster figures with heads embedded in their chests. So I found it interesting that these figures just started organically appearing. So I began exploring them, at the same time exploring found object media with the forms. My husband kind of introduced me to collecting primitive forms and started this hunt. It was kind of neat. It was his way of getting involved in the work as well. He would find these objects he thought I might be interested in. And then I started hanging on to them until I found connections to some of the work I was trying to do. I particularly, and you will notice on several occasions, am fond of high chairs. And that connection of the high chair to the child as an adult. In many ways, I think we're all kids, we're all children in the face of life. And when you look at the expanse of time in our very short time period here, we spend most of our time as children in many ways. So this reference of the chair to the form to me became very important. Excuse me, one moment. Sorry about that. So with looking at those surfaces, I returned to the figure and became more experimental with the connection of representational form with unexpected surfaces. And I would look at tree bark. That's what inspired this piece, the bark of the southern pine. And I found it fascinating to kind of continue on with the idea of bringing meaning and the connection of form to the surface, and started becoming much more mindful about where the narrative interplays with that form. I, of course, still continued to do work that was political in nature. This piece, for me, was a personal feeling of a punch to the gut as a result of the 2016 elections, and much of the work with dealing with that embedded head form came out in these ways. I continued with that form, exploring it, and then in 2018 did a sabbatical to Rome for an artist residency. And then on my way, also got the opportunity to explore work in London, Belgium, and Paris, initially with the thought of looking at homoeroticism and the male form as expressed in Art Nouveau. But as I was there and experiencing some of the sites of these cities I was exploring, and also getting an opportunity to see work that I had seen only in pictures outside of my traditional museum and gallery venues that I had access to in the States, I started looking at forms that inspired me while there. I got the opportunity to go to the Rodin Museum in Paris, and was really struck when getting to see the Gates of Hell in person, and the Three Shades piece that was done kind of in a larger form after the Gates of Hell piece. This piece influenced work, and based in that whole political issue, that continued these figures on in my own interpretation of the new Gates of Hell, essentially, and in the three shades as I saw them through some of my forms. I found myself with that, not that I had not been a somewhat political animal in the past, but with 2016 forward, the politics of the time started rearing its head in much of my work, and I kind of couldn't pass it up, as did my continual use of textures. This is based off of a fountain that I saw in Rome, but continuing those figures and working with the dual figure, but this time as it was embedded in form. So when I came back, I continued looking at some of that imagery, continued with the themes I was interested in politically, but also kind of a return to a personal reflection on different experiences. And this piece was really a reflection of my own personal experiences of religion and religious life, but kind of in terms of where we are as society, trying to find meaning in multiple forms. So as you deconstruct this piece, I found this really wonderful, old, funky, kind of 70s baptism, holy water fountain, and thought I had to have it. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I held on to that thing for 3 years. And started reflecting on this idea of we just find wacky ways of trying to express our own spiritual paths. So this piece, in the face of the universe, looking at us, saying, "You're trying to figure your life out, and I'm just here as a bottle of seltzer water." So the spray of water in the face from the fountain, the images stacked on top of one another are references to earth spirits, water spirits, that sort of thing. There are both Celtic and serpent mound imageries kind of tattooed on the back of the piece and along the shoulder. I thought of it as my own kind of crazy pathway. Let's try this, let's try that. Eventually, it all kind of, for me, comes back to laugh with you more than at you. So it was fun doing this piece. Of course, right after that, in a return to my studio and getting ready for the exhibition, immediately after that was part of my sabbatical work, immediately after that sabbatical and that sabbatical show, we closed down at our school probably about a week later, 2 weeks later, because of the wave of COVID that was hitting, and everything was shutting down. I don't know if any of you have ever gotten the unexpected joy, and I do mean that tongue in cheek, of trying to teach online, trying to do our whole lives online. And for me, it was the idea of doing an experientially based class with students that didn't have access in clay, but working in clay. So kind of an odd two-step to get that the essential points across to students and help them understand what they were working with while not getting to actually work with it. After that experience during the summer, I started doing this double entendre series, basically about the idea of mourning and healing. This piece is meant sort of tongue-in-cheek. This is called Mourning. The U is parenthetical, and it was intended as the idea of getting up in the morning, and for all of us, the experience of, okay, I've got to do this one more day, while in many ways being in mourning for the life we just left behind, as well as the lives that were lost and continue to be lost during that pandemic period. It also made me think about the healing process and how that's relevant across time, not just during the COVID shutdown, but also throughout our lives, and the wounds that always become part of who we are things that are to be embraced in many ways, and can be maybe not completely healed, but become part of our life experience. So in this piece, I started exploring that sense of kind of wounded healer, and at the same time being the healing the healer who is wounded. So it was kind of an interesting introspective time for me, and expressing those thoughts were cathartic, I think, in many ways, and I think it was able to make some connections through the work as well that were more personal and hopeful. This, of course, is the piece that's currently at Baltimore Clay Works. At this point, the continuation of political themes, especially as it relates to Second Amendment rights, and our pathetic response with offering thoughts and prayers as our quote only solution to gun violence in the U.S. was it just stuck with me. This was a piece that was headed in one direction, and then the Robb Elementary shootings in Uvalde occurred, and I couldn't help but respond. So I continued on with this piece, and that's where that came from. One of the great joys that I have had while teaching has been to experience some street art tours, and I have a fabulous colleague who I have gotten to co-facilitate with these travel courses. She's a pretty amazing instructor and has lined up so many incredible experiences for our students, and part of that has been street art tours. So I got just as caught up as the students did in the street art of different areas we looked, and I started resonating with some of the art, the mashup of artists, the mashup of work, the kind of cacophony of different voices all in one, the fight for trying to make your voice heard in combination with all of these other voices, while you're also trying to honor those. The humor of some of the pieces, if you will remember the Up movie, and I loved this sort of balloon animal Up Yours piece. Some of the other beautiful images that appeared on the wall, and also some of the political images, and getting perspectives. This Trump on a tricycle perspective was done in Rome, and it was really kind of a fascinating sort of piece to me. Also the reminders, personal reminders of never being afraid to reinvent yourself. All of these were fun to see, but I didn't realize how much it started influencing my work. So I started bringing that kind of cacophony of imagery back into the studio and exploring with it. And this is where those chaotic parts of my own personal upbringing, became interesting to tap into and use as a great source in the artwork, and how we as individuals, and myself as part of the LGBTQIA plus community, are tasked with putting together our identities and figuring out who we are, and taking these disparate parts of our experiences to put them together to really create this sense of who we are. And instead of being this Frankenstein of different experiences, you're actually this blend of clashing surfaces and disparate thoughts that turn into this whole form that speaks to many issues. This one, for me, was speaking to the political maneuvering through finances of Congress. It's called Bipartisan, with bi being spelled B-U-Y, and it was my kind of exploration of Congress's hands tying themselves together at their own choice through finance. I also started looking at again, some of the iconography that I was intrigued with. This is a reference to Holy Family. It is called Holy Family, but WHOLLY, kind of, not kind of, but directly talking about the sanctity of the family that is expressed through the LGBTQIA plus community and families there that we share in that sanctity of family and raising children, or not raising children, should we choose. So for me, it was a nod to LGBTQIA plus families everywhere. I also did some pieces that were very representational of my own experiences, and I just did a larger form, cut it into pieces, resectioned and offset it with multiple textures, multiple patterns and approaches. This was kind of a nod to really just a direct nod to my own life experience. Also a nod was this fun way of talking about the chaos that anyone does when they kind of go hunting around in their own family or family tree for stories. This piece is my riff on Pandora's box. And once you open that thing of looking at your own family history, be prepared for what you may or may not find. I think it's, for me, it's a fun, very humorous, tongue-in-cheek sort of approach, which I do love. So just kind of wrapping things up, I find myself at an interesting crossroads. This is an outside image that I just shot a few days ago coming into the ceramic studio at school. And I loved the fact that we had this freshly paved blacktop. And within, I think, probably 2 weeks, this is what it looked like outside of the ceramic studio. We made our own wayfinding map. So I always thought it was funny that people would show up and ask, where's the ceramic studio? And I thought, did you not just park in the parking lot? Can you tell where maybe we are? But for me, it's also interesting because I'm going through a process of phased retirement and from teaching. I'm not retiring from artwork. I'm doing quite a lot there. So I'm at a bit of a transitional time. And for me, the footsteps were an interesting metaphor for my meandering path now. What's next, and what am I working on? And I find that that's getting reflected in the studio, in some of the artwork. I've been watching a lot of birds, particularly crows, in our yard, and kind of looking at mythology and history of the imagery of the raven and the crow, and playing with that in some of the imagery. But it's really reflective of where I am right now and transitions going on in my life. And the most recent piece, Liminal State, is a reference to that. Again, back to the high chair and that feeling of kind of starting a new path and feeling like a child in it. So kind of to wrap things up, my artwork initially, I was a little bit self-conscious that so much of it seemed to flow from personal experience and talking about that. And then a friend of mine reminded me that when working and trying to be universal in my approach, that it's easy to water down the message unless you're speaking more directly about your own experience and putting it out there for people to see. So I've kind of allowed myself the luxury of talking more about my experience through my art and just letting it find the audiences that hopefully it will find. So that's about all I've got for you. So thanks for listening.